'Cause fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello and welcome to the Salt Strong live streaming podcast. My name is Rich Natoli. I'm the regular host of this show. And tonight I am not joined by co-host Ed Gobo. He is at soccer tryouts and a baseball game tonight. So obviously family comes first. So Ed has the night off, but I have Pat Ogletree coming on tonight, and we're going to do a little bit of a different slant. So it's kind of the mix between the coach's show, where you can ask any questions that you may have. And we want to try to focus the content tonight on marsh fishing. And that's a really big topic for, man, it doesn't even matter where you are. If you're down in Texas, you're fishing marshes and flats. If you're in Louisiana, Mississippi, actually, I think Pat's in Mississippi right now. We'll have to check on that. Florida, Georgia, everywhere, all the way up through New Jersey, New York, you can find marshes, and marshes can be incredibly productive for inshore fishing for the spring. So that's what we want to focus on today. And that's what the topic's going to be. As we jump into this, I want to just say hi to the people that are in the chat right now. We have Mikey Likes It. We have Nicholas, Bill Deekhouse, Kennedy DJ, James Flynn, Participation Trophy Fishing, Crabbin' and Fishing, who, by the way, is in the thumbnail of this live stream. That's Ben floating by me in the kayak in the thumbnail. We have Tad Drummond, John C., and I think that covers it for right now. So everybody, if you haven't chatted, welcome. Good to see you here. If you're listening on the podcast after the recording of this, welcome. This is going to be a fun one, and we're going to jump right in. I'm going to bring Pat onto the stream. Pat, how you doing, man?
Good. How you doing today, man? I'm glad to be here.
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to the next weather window here. Actually, you know what? We went for a month in the Mid-Atlantic. Well, it's not just the Mid-Atlantic. It's pretty much the entire coast and the Gulf. The wind has been blowing everybody out. It's no different where I am. And we're now into a nice pattern that is going to be very fishable for very many days with warming weather. So I'm just waiting to get back out on the water. And I think Wednesday is going to be my day. So I'm so excited. But you were out today, right?
Yeah. I actually got out on the water. We were kind of in the same situation. I'm in Mississippi right now, but I've been fishing the Gulf Coast from Texas to Louisiana the past few months. And we were in the same situation. I mean, the wind's blowing 20, 25 every day. And, it's just no fun. And finally, this past week is the first week where I'm seeing single digit wind speeds for, like a week long, and not just like so yeah, I'm gonna get out on the water as much as I can and soak it all in before it goes south and we get some bad weather in. But it's odd. I'm not used to the weather here. I don't know if it's normal here in Mississippi, but what I'm running into right now is we get those mid-morning thunderstorms that are coming through about 9-10 o'clock in the morning, which really shortens your day up. So hopefully that's just a weird thing and not a normal thing.
Well, I'm lucky. I don't have to deal with that. For us up here, I'll talk about New Jersey specifically because that's where I do most of my fishing. It's like the 2 o'clock wind shift is what we typically have, where it just shifts and it picks up speed. So that kind of makes the end of the day difficult. And if you've had a really good day, that's when you pack it up and start heading in. And if you've been grinding, that's where you get desperate to get that fish so you can get out of there sometime in the near future. But I was out on the water this past week, Pat, and while it was a bit of a grind for me and I didn't have a ton of fish, I had some quality fish. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was out there is there are a lot of people around that I can see, and they're all around the marshes, and they're not necessarily fishing in the quote unquote right places. So they can see the marsh, they're next to the marsh. They could, if you pan out on a video, they may say they're in the same spots as I am, but they're not. And you see a lot of mistakes that people make, and it's just simply because, a lot of them just don't know. And then some of them, their boat can't get to where they really should be because they have to be careful. But I thought it would be a good topic. And Pat, you fish marshes almost continuously.
Mhm.
So you're a great person to have on to talk about that. And I prefer fishing marshes over open water any day of the week. So wanted to jump in and do that. And we could talk about all the species all the way from the southernmost points in Texas all the way up the East Coast. So people, if you have any questions, any comments or anything, put that in the chat. And with that, I want to get started and ask you, Pat, do you want to just kind of go through what you envision when somebody says marsh fishing?
Yeah, actually, like you said before, that is something that I really enjoy doing. And if I could get a shot at marsh fishing, that's the way I'm going to do it. I don't know if it's because, I've had so much success, a lot of success fishing in the marshes, or have I had a lot of successes because I always fish in marshes? I'm not sure how that worked out, but, when I think of marshes, I'm thinking of, basically drains that are coming out of the backcountry that are flowing into maybe the ICW or some of barrier islands. If you're going down into South Texas, they don't necessarily call it marshlands. There's, bayous and drains off the mainland, but it fishes all kind of the same. Even when, looking up in North Carolina, you talk about the area around, say, Topsail Island, that whole stretch. And, you've got the ICW that runs, north-south through there. And then you've got all these feeder rivers and creeks that come out that has grass lines along the main river that's usually lined with oyster beds. And that's heaven for me. I mean, I can fish that all day long. I just absolutely love it.
I'm going to agree. And yeah, for me, the marsh is basically anything that has grass growing on it. And it has nothing to do with depths. And that's going to be one difference between the different areas. You talk to people. I mean, Pat, we talk about it, with Salt Strong internally about deep water, and deep water is very different between us.
Mhm.
What do you consider deep water?
If my knees get wet, if I get out of the kayak, so about 3 foot, that's deep.
Yeah. And deep here is probably 50, 60 feet. If I can stand, I'm probably looking for a different area to fish. And it's just, it's just the difference between the areas. But the marshes here, yeah, it's back in the backwaters. It's the sod banks is really what most people call them.
Mhm.
And it's just got the channels running through it. And you have everything from the flats all the way down to the deep holes. And for me, when I'm back there fishing those, some of the areas that I'm looking for the most when targeting ambush predator species like a flounder or a fluke, a weak fish, I could say redfish and speckled trout, but they don't really visit my area too often. But when we're talking New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, New York, I'm looking for those species, and they really set up in similar types of areas. And I think that's what I want to go through tonight. I want to talk about the different areas, what people should be looking for when they're out there. Now, what species are you typically going for when you're back in the marshes looking for some tight lines?
It's the big three that we have down here. That's gonna be the flounder, the trout, and the redfish. And typically, they'll be set up in the same types of areas. Matter of fact, today they were exactly where I was fishing. So I'm in Mississippi now. I was fishing in Louisiana last month, and the month before that was Texas. And I'm literally fishing the same exact pattern, just in different states. So the trout and the flounder were on creek mouths on an incoming tide, and the redfish are on grass lines on an outgoing tide. And that's really been a consistent pattern for me for probably the past 2 months. But that's the big three that I look for.
Okay. And I'll put my three as the striped bass, the fluke, and the weak fish. Those are all three that I target mostly. Now, I'm going to roll into a couple of questions. We do have questions coming in here already. I do want to bring this one up and just, Pat, just throw this your way because you do fish Texas. You fish Laguna Madre.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just fishing Laguna Madre in January and February both. Love the Laguna Madre. It's probably the best trout fishing in the United States as far as numbers and quality. Just absolutely amazing. Love that whole area. It's big. It's definitely a long body of water, but it basically goes from Corpus Christi all the way down to Port Isabel, which is I'm not sure the exact number, but it's probably a couple hundred miles. But absolutely great fishing.
Yeah, and I wanted to so for everyone that doesn't know, I knew the answer to that, but I wanted everyone to know the answer to that just to kind of show, look, we really do have Pat here who is experienced fishing and 2 months just this year down in that area consistently. So yes, there's some familiarity there. Now, we're going to roll into the first question from Bill Deekhouse, and we could both answer this. And Pat, if you want to go first, actually, let me go first on this one. It'll make it easier for me to get to the next question as we go. What's the one main thing you look for when picking a spot in a marsh area to fish? Bill, this is a difficult question because I don't look for just one thing. There are things that have to be there, otherwise I'm moving on. And, I guess if I had to say one thing, it's structure. And I'm looking for structure that is different than everything else in the area. So I'm always looking for something that's different, the one thing that doesn't belong. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be structure under the water. That's one of the things. And the reasons for that, there are a few reasons for it. One, it's a good spot for ambush predators to hide, right? So they can hide in that area and it makes it easier for them to ambush their prey. The other thing is it brings a consistent flow of bait into a predictable area for them. So they don't have to go traveling all over the place. Think of striped bass as an example. Yes, during the migrations, they will move and they will follow menhaden, but they are actually ambush predators normally when they're not actually migrating. So they don't swim around like bluefish or tuna looking for something. They don't have that forked tail that they're out there consistently like a pelagic just looking for these meals. They want it to come to them. It saves them calories. It's less calorie expenditure to get their meal. So you have that. And then the other thing is it brings the bait fish. So the bait fish actually also need the cover and they need the structure to hide from those big fish. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. The bait fish are there trying to hide from the big fish. The big fish are there trying to get the little fish. So I'm looking for structure. I'm looking for changes. So if it's a flat bottom, I'm not fishing there. If there is something interesting that's going to interrupt the flow of the current, push things in a consistent area, that's what I'm looking for specifically. What about you, Pat?
Yeah, I like your answer. I mean, that's pretty much the things I look for. If I had to narrow it down to one, it would probably be bait first. But I'm looking for bait near structure. And anytime that there's either a current break that can create an ambush point or a pinch point that can accelerate the current and cause a current seam, those are the places that I'm going to start. But for me, it's bait. I'm not going to fish an area that doesn't have signs of a good amount of bait. I'm not saying that there's not going to be fish there if there's not bait there, but typically when you find bait, you're finding feeding fish, which is what I want to spend my time looking for, not stubborn fish that are just laid up and not not in the mood to feed. But yeah, if I can find bait, typically there's feeding fish around.
That's a really good point. One thing that I tell people is I don't use my fish finder really for a fluke season because you can't really see the fluke on it. They don't have a swim bladder. They're sitting on the bottom. So you don't really see them, but it's not entirely true because if you can find those bait balls down there. Now, again, it's different. You can see if you're fishing at your knees, you have 3 feet of water and you're feeling good, you can probably see a lot of bait. We can't necessarily see it in the mid-Atlantic because it's too deep. The water is not clear. It's like a green color. A nice, pretty, disgusting green color. So maybe you get 3 feet of visibility, but you can't see the 50 feet underneath it or the 20 feet underneath it. So the fish finder can actually help in a lot of cases. And if you're fluke fishing specifically and you see that bait, I mean, that's a good indication that you might want to drop down in that one specific area. And I would say, to your point, Pat, it is such a good indicator that even if it's a flat bottom, if I see bait, I will typically stop and I will drop down and just check it out and see if there's anything actively feeding underneath of it. It's a really good point. Tommy O Fishing, feel free to discuss the marshes in South Jersey, Atlantic County. Tommy, let me just tell you, that's where I fish. So for the most part, that's where I prefer to fish out of every place in the coast. So when I'm referring to marshes, I am specifically looking at Cape May in Atlantic County, and that's where I'm typically using as my frame of reference. So you are included in there if that's where you're typically fishing. James Flynn says that both of us love greenheads and flies and gnats being back there. And I would say it's actually not that bad where I fish. It's not bad at all unless it's sunrise or sunset. But I bring the DEET. What do you bring, Pat, to keep the bugs off of you?
I don't like using bug repellent because of the fact that if it gets on your hands, it's going to get on your lures. And bug repellent is one of the best fish repellents. Also, if you get any of that on your lures, they can pick that up from a long distance away. So, what I do, even in the Florida sun, whenever it's 98 degrees outside, I wrap up like a mummy. I'm wearing the performance shirt, long sleeve. I'm wearing gloves. I have a buff over my face. I literally I have no skin exposed, and it does a pretty good job. Now. There are some areas, like you said about being buggy, that they'll bite right through your clothes. But hopefully the wind will pick up and get rid of them.
Okay, and I'm the opposite. I like to wear as light as possible, so I will actually typically wear a tank top when I'm out fishing, just with my vest over top. So I will. So one thing I do, I don't like using. It's weird. I don't like using sunscreen because I don't like the chemicals in it getting into my blood. So I use zero. I do not use sunscreen unless I somehow get a burn, which I don't seem to get. But I will throw that DEET on me and season myself up nice and good somehow for that. But I try to avoid wearing a lot of long sleeves and long pants and all that stuff. So that's what I do. But I don't see a big deal. It doesn't really get too bad. I do bring a buff just in case they get really bad, because the thing that'll drive me out quickest is if I'm trying to breathe and I keep inhaling the gnats. That will do me in. But yeah.
What'll get me is when they get up in your beard and they start crawling around in your beard. I have this one driving me absolutely nuts. So yeah, you got to wear the buff and cover everything up.
Yeah, see, mine's not quite as glorious as yours, but it'll pick up bugs as well, and it feels weird too. It's really bothersome.
Like fleas.
Yeah, exactly, and I don't have fleas right now. This question, well, minis and fishies, put this in the chat. Some folks on this chat may not know what a weak fish is, and they're called different things, but. A weak fish is not a speckled trout, although it is similar and it does behave similarly, but not identical to it. It is different species. And the weak fish is what you're typically going to be focusing on if you're north of really Delaware is about where you're going to get the speckled trout to in targetable numbers. So north of that, it's going to be a weak fish if you want to do that type of fishing. So it's, but with that said, you get them down south. North Carolina, you're going to get them. You're going to get them in Florida. You're going to get them all over. But it is a species that is similar to the speckled trout. It is a extremely low population species. It's been devastated. And as the science tells us, it's by the dolphins, the dogfish, and seals and striped bass have just been crushing them. So that's what that is. So if we talk about those, that's what we're specifically referring to. As we're going through here, Pat, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the different types of structure that you are going to look for when you're heading back into the creeks in the marshes?
Yeah, there's two main structures that I look for. And just thinking about it today and what I was looking for. First one is I like creek mouths. So anytime that I'm seeing a creek mouth, and especially when that water's flowing, whether it be an incoming or an outgoing, I like the idea of a creek mouth, because what happens is it just concentrates everything. Now I know people are going to they fish things differently and they have different success in different types of tides. I prefer an outgoing tide. I think what happens with an outgoing tide is it flushes all that bait out of the backwater, and it just tends to concentrate the fish at these creek mouths. And if I can find a creek mouth that either has a dock on it with some hard structure or an oyster bed, that's all golden. I love that's like the Goldilocks spot. So you've got that current, you've got the bait that's getting flushed out, you got the hard structure for the fish to be able to hide, so they can ambush the bait. And also one thing that people have to realize too, whenever you're looking at hard structure, it's not just for them to use as an ambush point. It's also for them to get protection from predators like dolphin and shark and that kind of thing. If they can get up skinny and they can get away from that stuff, away from where their own predators can get them, that's even better. So yeah, oyster beds and creek mouths. If I can find that with some water flow, I feel pretty confident.
Yeah, I think those are great. We don't have many marshes in my area that would have the hard structure like a dock or anything close by it. In some areas of the country, you have a lot of docks out in the marshes. You don't have a lot of them here. And so what I'm looking for is I am looking for the intersection of two currents. So a creek mouth is essentially exactly what you just said. You know, a creek mouth is going to be it, only without the hard structure. We don't really have oyster beds in the area that I fish. We do have some clams. We have some dead oyster beds with just some loose shells around. But if I can find the junction of two currents where they intersect over some structure, meaning a ledge, so a deep drop, that's typically going to be a spot that I'm going to fish every single time. So a ledge where two currents meet, it's outstanding. And if you can find where more than two currents meet, and there are some places, if you go down in Cape May County, there are some places in the marshes where you can go back and you can actually have 5 or even 6 intersections of water in the same spot. And it's only about 3 feet of water. Pat, you would like that, but then it drops down to 12.
Ooh.
Where they all come together. It just burrows it out to 12 feet. Well, that right there, I'm stopping there every single time, and I'm going to try that because you're going to have a flounder in there. You're going to have, well, you have the potential for weak fish. It's not necessarily their first spot to go, but you'll absolutely have striped bass in there, and you'll have striped bass in there year round. And it's a spot that the one that I'm thinking of that has 6 waterways intersecting, I will go through there every once in a while. And as I'm going to the next spot for flounder, I'm throwing out some paddle tails and I'm picking up some resident schoolies as I go through the area, toss them back as I go through and back to the fluke on the other side. Yeah, I definitely really love the multiple currents coming together. And to me, that's what it's all about. If you can find those current seams over a drop, it's just a beautiful, beautiful setup for you. Now, Pat, we have a question for you. This is from Master, who asked about Laguna Madre earlier.
Yep.
And it's a good question. What's your setup that you're throwing when you're fishing that area?
Basically, what I like to do anytime that I am fishing an area like that, I like to bring 3 different setups that's going to cover the top of the water column, the middle of the water column, and the bottom of the water column. So even though you might be fishing in 3 feet of water, there's still, these fish are going to be feeding up top in the middle and the bottom. So I'm going to be throwing a top water, something like a moonwalker, skitterwalker, something along those lines. I'm going to have a paddle tail rigged on, and the paddle tail is going to be sized depending on the size of the bait that's in the area. So right now in the springtime, we've got fry bait, so it's going to be smaller. So I'm going to run like a 3 or 3.5 inch paddle tail, like our 2.0, and then for the bottom, I'm going to run a Marilure Little John. I actually love those lures. It's if you've never seen one, matter of fact, here we go, got one right here. It's a little plastic stick bait. And what it is the way this works is you rig it on a jig head, and it's like a jerk bait, but it's soft plastic, and this thing just darts all over the place. So this doesn't have any action. You just don't reel it straight in. Everything is imparted by the rod tip. And for whatever reason, that's just a great bait because what it does is it triggers that predatory instinct, that reactionary bite. So those are the 3 that I'm going to have up there. And between those 3, I'll figure out what part of that water column those fish are feeding in, and then I'll concentrate on it from there.
Great answer. I will answer for the Mid-Atlantic. And look, Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, I mean, that's a lot. It's a lot of area. I'm talking basically from Virginia all the way up through Maine. So I'm going to generalize a little bit here. So what I'm throwing, I'll go through my favorite setup right now. I have a 7'6" medium heavy TFO Pro, which I absolutely love. And I've caught striped bass over 50 inches on it. And I have caught flounder that are under 17 inches. I've caught striped bass that were right around 16 inches on there as well. And I've caught tog on there. And it's just a great rod. So that's what I'm using. I think it covers everything. It's very versatile. Is it the best for every single application? Absolutely not. But it is a very good roundabout rod to use if you want to go multi-species and you want to use the same setup. With that, I'm putting on I'm a Penn guy. So I'm a kayak fisherman who doesn't like to spend a lot of money to replace gear that I accidentally drop overboard. So I use a Penn Fierce 3. Again, that exact setup. I've caught all those fish that I've just talked about. I have 15-pound braid on there, Power Pro, just regular Power Pro with the high vis line. I use typically anywhere from a 20-pound leader up to 40 pounds. And as far as what I'm throwing out there, I am throwing out bucktails for most of the year for most of the species. For fluke, I default to a bucktail, and I would put a soft plastic on there. I'm in between on whether gulp works better than a scented regular soft plastic. I'm not sure what I believe right now, because last year I did just as well on both. So we'll just leave it at that. A soft plastic on a bucktail. A regular jig head with a soft plastic is definitely going to be number 2. And number 3, that's difficult because I don't like spending a ton of time with it. It's got to be a top water. So just insert your favorite top water, and I'll I always have one with me. It's just I don't spend a lot of time doing it. Unlike Pat, who just spends a year at a time fishing only top waters, I have very little patience for it. So if you have that set up, you'll do well in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. We have another one for you, Pat, because I have not fished Texas. From the Clevengers, have you ever fished Bessie Heights Marsh in Port Arthur, Texas? Been wanting to check it out, and mainly fishes from a John boat with a motor and trolling motor.
I was just there 2 weeks ago, as a matter of fact. Now, I didn't fish Bessie Heights. I fished right around the corner from it, but I know exactly where it's at. And yeah, it can be a little dangerous back there. But right now, the redfish are up in the marshes, so they're on the grass lines right now. They're chasing bait. Basically, again, I like a falling tide. It seems to pull all the bait out from the grass to make it accessible to the redfish. And during a falling tide, especially, I like a last third of that falling tide because it really concentrates everything together. But right now, yeah, they're catching redfish there. If you can get up in there, I would definitely give it a shot for sure.
So what makes it dangerous? Because that was part of the question for those that are listening on the podcast. They've been wanting to check it out, but have been told it can be dangerous at times. What would make it dangerous?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure. Maybe the shallow water, or for me, there's tons of alligators in there because I'm in a kayak. So that was always my issue with fishing in Louisiana. It seemed like every time I was getting on the redfish, there was just tons of alligators nearby. So maybe that's what they're talking about, but or it could just be the shallow water back there.
Gators? No. You guys down south have all these crazy things that you have to deal with. Red tide, alligators. No, we don't have to deal with that stuff. We have some sharks, but you probably have more sharks down there.
Yeah. Actually, no. I saw 6 alligators today.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd be afraid of them, but I would be a little bit nervous about tipping over, because that can happen no matter how good you are. Now, the biggest fear that we have up here in New Jersey specifically is people like Snooky and the situation out on their boat on the weekends, drinking too much and not looking for kayaks and smaller boats and waking everybody. But otherwise, I feel pretty good up here most of the time if the wind's not blowing too hard. Man,
just dealing with the wind and the current. That's your biggest thing.
Yeah, we deal with actual fishing stuff, and we don't have to worry so much about what's trying to eat us. All right, here's another one. Pat, you're popular. This is from Cody. Hey, Cody. Hey, Pat, have you ever used a craw imitation?
Hey, what's up, Cody? Yeah, I saw your report on your tournament win, and I was reading about that.
That's crazy.
I haven't done it, but I know people that have, and I don't see why it wouldn't. Sorry, that's my dog back there. I wouldn't see why it wouldn't work because it seems like it would imitate a crab really well. And I was actually thinking about maybe trying out using a swim jig that they use for bass fishing, and then putting a craw trailer and just clipping one of the craws off, so it looks like one claw, and just swimming along the bottom, making it look like a blue crab or something along there. I bet you that would be killer.
I bet you would. I think your dog didn't like that answer.
My
dogs do that too.
He's just mad that he's not the center of attention right now. He's not being paid
That sounds about right. Yeah. So yeah. That's a really good question. And I think one of the things that people forget about is a lot of the strikes that you can get are going to be reaction strikes. And one of the best top water bait, no joke, not lying, saltwater striped bass, toss a frog. Toss a frog up towards the marshes. There are no frogs around. The way that it works, the way that you can see it moving, and the wake that it puts off, throw a top water frog and it'll work. So, as far as a craw imitation, I never hesitate to use those. I'll use those freshwater soft plastics that are, the crawdad ones, the crayfish ones. It's all the same to me. And I honestly don't notice that much of a difference between them if they have the same action as, a similar type of lure. So, and in some cases, you get more action. You get more action out of a crawfish than you will out of a shrimp pattern in some, depending on which actual plastic you buy. But I wouldn't hesitate to use any of those.
Yeah.
And again, if you fish for striped bass, try a frog. It actually works. Now, the biggest problem is they will bend out those hooks. So if they come rigged, you're probably going to bend out the hook because they are not meant for a striped bass. It's just meant for a small, smallmouth or a largemouth or something like that. Oh, this is a good comment here from Participation Trophy. I always forget the water belongs to the giant cruisers. I'm just an unwanted trespasser in their way. Yeah, it can feel like that at times. Let's talk a little bit about the bait that I want to throw out on Wednesday. And this Cody also had a question about it. The Z-Man kicker crab. Have you used that yet?
I've thrown it around, but I'll be honest with you. I haven't really used it a whole lot. I know Matt absolutely loves it. He just came in 9th in a tournament this past weekend, and his measure fish came on the kicker crab. He's been throwing that a lot, but I have nothing against it. I think it's going to work great. It's just, for whatever reason, I just keep going back to my old standbys. I'm a paddle tail guy, topwater guy. It's hard for me to deviate off that, which I know I need to expand my horizons a little bit. But whenever things get tough, you always seem to go back with what you know. And I think what I need to do is I need to dial in an area and get confident where these fish are going to be at, start throwing something else, build up some confidence in that. But the problem is I never fish the same area twice. Literally, I never fish the same area twice. So it's hard for me to dial in a bite.
I went through a couple of years ago. I had the goal that I wouldn't fish throughout the entire year until August. Late August, I would allow myself to go back to an area I'd fished before. And it was one of my best years, but it was probably because I was so focused on making sure I was doing a really good plan before I went out on the water. But I after that, I do go back to the same areas, not necessarily the same spots, same areas regularly. And I have a really difficult time starting with anything but what I prefer, my confidence bait. So I have to force myself out of that. And with that said, I have several packs of the Z-Man kicker crabs that I want to use because I am sure that those are going to be outstanding for the spring fluke bite that's going on right now. And for those that aren't aware, at this time of the year in New Jersey and New York and Delaware and Maryland, along the coast, these fluke are pushing up into the shallower areas. So if you're back in the Sound, if you're back in the marshes and the shallower creeks, that's where they are. And if you open them up after you catch them, and I did this just 2 days ago, they are packed with crabs. They are absolutely packed with crabs because there's crabs all over the marshes. So if you're fishing the outgoing tide and the water's rushing off of the marshes, well, it's sweeping crabs out. And that's what they're just waiting for at the mouths of these creeks where Pat's fishing. So I think the kicker crab's going to be a good one to use, Cody. And as Pat said, Matt is absolutely in love with the thing. I have not used it yet, despite the fact that I've had it for weeks. It just hasn't been good enough weather to get out there and give it a try. But I'm hoping to on Wednesday. Definitely hoping to on Wednesday. All right. So let's talk a little bit. We're not, just so you guys know, we're not going to go real long tonight, but we have maybe 5 or 10 more minutes left. Wanted to ask you a question, Pat. I know it's not your species that you're really focused in on. And I guess if I had redfish around me all the time and speckled trout, maybe it wouldn't be mine. But let's talk a little bit about flounder. Where's one spot that you would say you're definitely going to look every single time that's not a dock at the end of a creek mouth for flounder when you're back in the marshes?
If I can find a deep hole, Like you said, if there is an intersection of two or more currents that's creating a deeper hole, I'm pretty confident in that. And I'm thinking specifically when I was up in North Carolina fishing that, there's an area that has just a ton of oyster beds, and those oyster beds will direct current. Now, there's times that these oyster beds will actually, direct this current, and it merges. And even though it might not seem like there's any creek mouths that are there, if you just watch the flow of those oyster beds, and it basically is creating a giant eddy, and in between the oyster beds, say it's 4 or 5 feet deep, but there's an 8-foot hole there, that's where those flounder are going to be.
Yeah, and they'll stack.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those things where it's almost like speckled trout. You keep throwing at the same hole, and an hour later you're still catching. You're like, where are they coming from? That's like a little. I did that down in North Carolina, the Pamlico Sound. I kept tossing. And it's literally, I had my anchor out on my kayak. It's only about 2 feet of water, so I'm barely, I could see the bottom really easily, and I'm tossing at a pothole, and I'm there forever. And it's just it's probably every other cast, I'm pulling out a nice sized speckled trout, and it just went on and on and on. Well, you get the same thing with the flounder if you get in the right spot for them. That's a really good spot for it. I actually don't have a different one. I would absolutely agree that if you can find a deep hole with a little bit of current going into it, that's going to be an outstanding spot to find them.
And a deep hole is relative. So if you're fishing a 3-foot flat and there's a 5-foot hole, that's a deep hole. If you're fishing 10 feet, you might need 15 or 20 feet, but it's relative terms. So yeah, you get a pothole that's just a little bit deeper on that grass flat, that's where they'll be.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'll be honest, I typically don't look at it that way. And it depends on where you are, I guess. If it's a flat and it's consistently 3 feet for a mile, which, talk about Texas, that's what you have for Texas. You can just go for miles, and you have a 6-inch deviation in that little pothole, and you can usually see them. You have a little pothole that's a little, 6 inches deeper. That's a big change. That's a very big change, and that's going to definitely draw those fish into that spot, especially the flounder that are just going to hunker down right inside there and just kind of come up. That's a good point. Relative depth changes is a big thing. Definitely a big thing. The question there was the kicker crab. Oh, okay. Cody answered it. Is the kicker crab going to be good for sheep's head? And it looks like Cody said that it's probably a little bit big. I'm going to agree with that. I would not use the kicker crab for sheep's head. It is a very robust soft plastic. It's big for their mouths. Now, for a flounder that can open its mouth really wide, for speckled trout, for redfish, not an issue at all. But you start talking about a sheep's head, I wouldn't be going for that, especially because unlike a live bait or a dead bait, you're going to be working the kicker crab, which is just going to make it even more difficult for it to get over that entire tail and onto that hook. So I typically would not typically. I definitely would not recommend using that for sheep's head. Now, with that said, when somebody says, "Well, Rich, I'm going to prove you wrong," please send me the pictures because I hope I'm wrong. I just wouldn't do it. So, you feel any differently about that, Pat?
Nah, I agree. It's a rather large bait. I mean, if you're looking for an artificial for sheep's head, Chase Baits makes one that's called a crusty crab. It's a realistic little crab. It's only like maybe 1.5 inches. It's a tiny little lure, and those are actually really effective. You can slather that up with some scent and either drop it vertically down a pylon or a dock or anything like that, and you can catch sheep's head artificial. But that kicker crab, yeah, that's a hunk of plastic. It's pretty big.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that crab. I was looking down when you were talking about that because I just had one in my hand and I dropped it on the floor. But yeah, they're really tiny. They're really tiny crabs. Now, I have a question for you on that. So if you're fishing sheep's head and you're using one of those, there's like no weight on that at all. How are you getting it down to the bottom? What type of rig setup are you using? Because I'll tell you one thing, Pat, fishing for sheep's head in the mid-Atlantic, people really want to figure out how to do it effectively and get consistent catches on artificials.
Yeah, I think the issue that's the difference really is you guys just deal with way more current than we do. And I say we down south. Our idea of a lot of current flow is probably a weak neap tide to you guys. So I think it just has to do with weight. I mean, I think that crusty crab's only a quarter of an ounce, maybe if that. So you pretty much have to do it in where there's, I wouldn't say no current, but little current, and you're not doing it 20 feet deep. You're dropping that down, maybe 7-8 feet at the most, bringing it up one dock pile and then just dropping down to the next one. And that's really what it's designed for. Trying to go 20 feet deep in a 4-knot current, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, go in the back bays, off of the ICW, and go into the lagoons basically and fish those pilings. Which, by the way, they're surprisingly good for those types of, and actually for flounder too, which is amazing. It's like the one exception to the current. If you have a lot of really old docks, especially in the water with a lot of pilings, you can still pick up the flounder, even in the lagoons where there's not a lot of current bringing the bait fish to them, because they just have their consistent supply of bait fish coming off of the pilings all day. So I would say that. Now, I'll also say that the docks up here in the mid-Atlantic are the least worked, excellent structure that's out there. So in other words, for such good structure and a good place to find these fish, especially fluke, almost nobody actually fishes a dock up here. Now, it's a lot different. You may throw under 5 to 7 feet of water down south. Well, some of the docks up here, especially on the ICW, may be over 40 feet of water. So you got an extremely long piling that you're going to be working around. But I would recommend doing it. There are times where it's really windy out and we'll just drift by the docks and we'll be picking up flounder and nobody else can do it because they're out in the wind. Well, we're not. And then we do annoy some people who are sitting on their docks trying to have fun, and we're sitting, we're drifting by 3 feet from them, but hey, we're catching fish, right? I think that covers most of the questions that we're going to be able to get to. Pat, before we go, is there anything that you want to throw out there for everybody?
We talk about marsh fishing, and I don't know how many people are actually, are regular marsh fishermen or they want to get into it. But one thing, if you're new to it, it's something that you want to try. Marsh fishing for me, it's all about the tides. It's very specific. Just because you go to an area one time and you're not seeing any activity or seeing any bait, it could be a great spot just on an opposite tide. So definitely keep your tides important. What I like to do is and this is how I fish. If I'm fishing an incoming tide, I'm usually fishing the grass lines or the creek mouths, and I'm looking for trout and flounder. That's how I fish. Now, when I'm looking for redfish, I want an outgoing tide, and I like a bottom third or maybe even the first third of an incoming, but I like the least amount of water possible when it comes to redfish. But some people fish the opposite. I've actually noticed that when I get out there, there are some people that only fish the incoming tide for whatever reason, or fish only the outgoing tide. But what I do is I just change species depending on the tide cycle.
Gotcha. And for me, I'll say to the people that are new to it, first of all, if you're in a kayak, don't be afraid to get lost back in the marshes, meaning just go back there and just check out every little creek that you find. And if you have electronics, turn them on and just take a look at what the depths are doing. So head back into these creeks and you'll find that you'll go into some of these. There's one specifically that I was fishing near just the other day, and you can't get in there at low tide. But if you go in at the right tide, you can get into the backwaters there, and there are holes back there that are over 20 feet deep. So the boats aren't getting back there. They can't get back there at any tide, but you can in a kayak, and almost nobody ever goes back there. There's one that in the past 20 years, I've only seen one other person back there, and he was with me. It was the co-host of this live stream went back there and was looking for holes down a different channel that I'd never been down in my entire life. Been fishing that area for 50 years. So don't be afraid to explore. Look for those hidden depths in the backwaters. Those are often going to be the places that, they may be really small spots, but nobody fishes them. So nobody's been fishing for that 25-inch fluke that's been sitting there for the past 3 weeks. So you may as well get your shot, shoot your shot at it, get back there and look for it, shoot your shot, and hopefully you can come out with something nice. So with that said, I think we're going to wrap this one up. I want to thank everybody for joining in today. We're going to announce the guests for the next live stream at the end of this week. So look, we've got some outstanding weather in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, all the way down through Virginia. I'm not as focused on what's happening down south. I'm guessing, Pat, that you guys down there are looking at some really nice fishing weather in the next week as well. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been looking at the forecast, and it's looking good. I've been waiting for this one for quite some time. It's when it comes to the wind, I don't mind the wind so much as long as I can find some protection. But when it starts blowing 20, 25 miles an hour, even in some protection, it just gets hard in a kayak. But everything that I've seen, the wind's down in single digits. And like I said, I'm going to hit the water as much as I can and get these fish figured out.
Yeah, I'm going to as well. If you're an insider member, all of you, if you can, get out there on the water and get some reports in the community, because I love to go in and see those. And I'm only going to be on the water one time this upcoming week. So I'm going to have to live vicariously through all of you. So let's fill up the community with all these awesome reports. I want to thank everyone for stopping by for tonight. Pat, thanks for coming on.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Until next time, guys, get out there, get on the water, get some tight lines.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul.